Happy New Year, everyone. Big day here in the UK New Year and a big change for education.
Big one.
That VAT on private school fees
Yeah,
we've been talking about, it's officially in effect.
it is.
So today we're taking a deep dive into the heart of this policy, examining reactions from a lively Reddit discussion thread, actually, that was sparked by a Guardian article and unpacking the arguments for and against it. Ready to get informed?
Let's dive in. I think it's so fascinating to see how this policy change is sort of revealing these deeper anxieties around, economic fairness, generational divides.
Yeah.
I think the government is clearly kind of leveraging public sentiment on this to counter, criticism from the opposition and right-wing media.
Yeah, and the numbers are pretty surprising.
Yeah?
A recent poll was commissioned by the Private Education Policy Forum,
Right.
or PEPF, a think tank focused on private education policy, found that 54% of people support this VAT, with only 22% opposed.
Yeah, what's so interesting is that level of support is actually higher than it was before the election.
Wow.
So the government knows this and is strategically using it to kind of bolster their position.
Yeah.
It's citing a poll from an organization that some might see as sympathetic to private schools is a clever way to sort of preempt accusations of bias.
Okay, so what's the government's main justification for this VAT?
Right.
Why now?
Well, their core argument is that it's all about funding state schools.
Okay.
They're projecting that this VAT will generate £1.7 billion by 2029-30, which they plan to use to hire 6,500 new teachers and bolster mental health provisions within state schools.
Okay, that sounds like a lot of money, but is it realistic?
That's the million-pound question. Will this VAT actually generate that much revenue? And it depends on several factors, including how private schools react to the policy. Will they absorb the cost? Will they pass it on to parents? Or will we see a significant shift of students from private to state schools? It's a complex equation with a lot of unknowns.
Yeah, and the government's very aware of the public's sensitivity to rising costs. I mean, the Guardian article highlights that private school fees have risen by a staggering 75%. Wow.
In real terms since
Let's
2000.
go.
Downing Street is using this to underscore how private education has become unaffordable for most families.
Right. It's a clever tactic.
Yeah.
By framing this VAT as a way to address this affordability crisis, the government's tapping into this deep-seated sense of fairness and shared burden. It's about shifting the narrative from taxing the wealthy to creating a level playing field.
Speaking of fairness, let's look at those reactions on Reddit. People are really feeling all kinds of ways about this new policy.
Yeah.
One commenter shared how their grandmother is furious about losing the winter fuel payment,
Oh, wow.
a government benefit for older people to help with heating costs during the winter months.
Right. It's so interesting how this policy is bringing these generational differences to the forefront.
Yeah.
The commenter mentioned that their grandmother, who lives comfortably, criticized them for being on job seekers allowance years ago.
Wow.
It highlights the contrasting views, on government assistance and economic responsibility across different age groups. Exactly. And it's not just about the money itself. There's a lot of frustration with perceived hypocrisy.
Yeah.
Another commenter mentioned how their nan blasts people who spend the winter fuel payment on booze, but is now upset about losing it herself.
Oh, the irony.
The irony is palpable.
These anecdotes really illuminate how personal experiences and deeply held beliefs often shape people's views on economic policies, regardless of data or logical arguments.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that we can't just look at the numbers, we have to understand the human stories behind them.
Absolutely. And these stories are all over that Reddit thread. You have those who see this VAT as a step toward greater economic equity, making the wealthy pay their fair share to improve state schools.
Yeah, it's a compelling argument for many.
Yeah.
They believe that private schools, which often benefit from charitable status and tax breaks,
Yeah.
not available to state schools, have an unfair advantage.
Yeah.
This VAT is seen as a way to address that imbalance.
Many comments echo that sentiment that private schools have been enjoying a free ride for too long while state schools struggle with funding cuts. It's about leveling the playing field and ensuring that all children have access to quality education regardless of their background.
And the government's choice of language is also revealing. They're framing this as ending a VAT break rather than imposing a new tax.
Right.
It's a subtle but powerful shift that positions them as restoring balance rather than unfairly targeting private schools.
But it's not just about taking money from one group and giving it to another. Some commenters are proposing solutions that go beyond just taxation. One thought-provoking suggestion is that private schools should offer a certain percentage of their places for free to local children,
Interesting.
fostering greater social mixing. What do you think about that idea?
That's a really interesting proposition. It gets to the heart of concerns about social mobility and creating a more inclusive education system. I think it's worth exploring how such a system could be implemented effectively and what impact it might have on both private and state schools.
It would definitely be a significant change, but it's encouraging to see people thinking beyond just the immediate financial implications and considering long-term solutions.
It's crucial to have these conversations about the type of education system we want to build for the future. One that's equitable, accessible, and provides high-quality education for all students, regardless of their socioeconomic background.
So we've heard from those who support the VAT, but what about the concerns being raised?
One worry is that this will disproportionately impact middle-class families who are already stretching to afford private education for their children.
That's a valid concern. Is the government acknowledging this potential burden?
Well, they're pushing back on that argument,
Yeah.
claiming that the sky-high fees we discussed earlier have already priced out most middle-class families.
Okay.
They argue that the VAT won't significantly alter the accessibility landscape because private education has already become largely unattainable for many.
I'm not sure that will resonate with everyone.
Yeah.
It's a point of contention that's likely to fuel further debate.
Absolutely. People will interpret the impact on affordability based on their own experiences and perspectives. It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
What are some of the other arguments against this VAT that we're seeing?
One of the main points raised is the international comparison argument. Critics argue that many European countries don't tax private education, suggesting that the UK is being unusually harsh.
That's a good point. Why single out private schools for this kind of taxation when it's not common practice elsewhere?
Well, the Guardian article quotes a professor who argues that the British private school system is unique in its exclusivity and high fees, making it a valid target for taxation.
Hmm.
He suggests that those international comparisons are flawed because the UK system operates within a very specific historical and social context.
That's interesting. So it's not just about what other countries are doing, but also about how private education functions within the UK and its impact on social mobility and equality.
Exactly. The debate transcends mere tax revenue. It's about the values we prioritize as a society and the kind of future we want to build.
And speaking of context, something really surprising popped up in that Reddit thread. Did you know that EU law previously prevented the UK from imposing VAT on private education?
That's right. It's a fascinating twist that highlights the unexpected consequences of Brexit.
Yeah.
This VAT is indirectly enabled by the UK's departure from the EU.
I can only imagine what those Brexit-supporting private school advocates are thinking right now. This policy change is likely to stir up some complicated feelings.
It certainly adds another layer of complexity to the public discourse around both Brexit and private education. I think it will be interesting to see how people grapple with this unexpected outcome.
This entire situation is so fascinating. It really highlights the interconnectedness of politics, economics, and personal values. It's not just a theoretical policy discussion. It's about real people's lives, their anxieties about the future, and their beliefs about what a fair and just society should look like.
Absolutely. These decisions have ripple effects that extend far beyond the immediate financial implications. They shape our communities, our opportunities, and our sense of shared responsibility.
There's so much more to explore, and we've only just scratched the surface. Stay tuned for part 2 of this deep dive, where we'll delve deeper into those Reddit reactions and unpack more of the arguments for and against this VAT on private school fees.
Yeah, you're right. The human element of this policy change is really what makes it so compelling. It's not just about numbers and spreadsheets. It's about people grappling with these real anxieties and hopes for the future.
Exactly, and those anxieties are on full display in that Reddit thread.
Yeah.
One recurring theme is the perception that private schools are, well, essentially businesses disguised as charities.
Right. That's a sentiment that I think often tied to the belief that these schools are hoarding resources and benefiting from these tax breaks that state schools can only dream of. It taps into this broader conversation about fairness and ensuring that everyone has a shot at a good education, regardless of their background.
There's also palpable anger I'm seeing directed at parents perceived as wealthy and out of touch. Commenters are pointing to the irony of those driving fancy cars while complaining about having to pay a bit more for their kids' education.
Yeah, there's a sense that some of those complaints are coming from a place of privilege. Perhaps a lack of awareness of the struggles faced by families who are barely making ends meet, let alone worrying about private school tuition.
I found this one comment particularly striking. My son's state school can't even dream of having the resources my brother's private school has. Maybe instead of charging parents 20% more, they should make a few cuts.
Hmm. That comment really gets to the heart of the matter, doesn't it? It's about priorities and where we as a society choose to invest our resources. Do we prioritize tax breaks for institutions primarily serving the wealthy, or do we redirect those funds to improve the education system for the vast majority of children?
It's about making choices that reflect our values and aspirations for a more equitable society. And some people are arguing that, if private schools are struggling to absorb this VAT cost, perhaps they should examine their own spending habits.
Hmm.
You know?
There's a feeling of why should taxpayers subsidize luxury education for the elite, especially when the state school system faces constant funding challenges and many families are struggling just to put food on the table.
Yeah. Some are even calling out the hypocrisy of private schools raising fees year after year while simultaneously bemoaning this new VAT.
Yeah, it does seem a bit disingenuous to complain about a 20% VAT increase when fees have already jumped 75% in recent decades.
It's like they're saying, we can raise fees without any backlash, but the moment the government tries to do something, it's a crisis.
Right. This perceived hypocrisy is fueling a lot of the anger and resentment.
Mm.
It raises questions about, who gets to set the rules and who benefits from the current system.
Okay, so beyond the immediate reactions, what about the potential long-term consequences of this VAT?
Right.
One concern I'm seeing is that it could actually exacerbate social segregation.
Yeah, the fear is that as private schools become even more expensive, it will further widen the gap between those who can afford a privileged education and those who are left behind in an underfunded state system.
Some on Reddit are suggesting that private schools should be mandated to offer a percentage of places for free to local children from lower-income families. They argue that this would foster diversity and create a more level playing field.
It's a very interesting proposal and one that deserves careful consideration. I think it speaks to the core of concerns about social mobility and ensuring that everyone has a fair shot at success regardless of their postcode.
But there are also concerns that this VAT could backfire and hurt the very people it's meant to help. What if it ends up driving some private schools out of business, leading to fewer options for parents and potentially overwhelming the state school system?
These are valid concerns, and it's still too early to say definitively what the long-term impacts will be. It's going to depend on several factors, including how private schools adjust their pricing and operations and whether the government follows through on its promises to invest in state schools.
It's a complicated issue with no easy answers. And it's important to acknowledge that there are legitimate arguments on both sides. It's not as simple as, private schools are bad or taxation is bad.
Yeah, we need to move beyond these simplistic narratives and engage in nuanced, informed discussions about how to create an education system that works for everyone.
So we've covered public reactions, arguments for and against the VAT, and potential consequences.
Right.
But there's one more piece of the puzzle to consider, the Brexit connection.
Yes. The fact that this VAT is only possible because of Brexit adds a whole new dimension to this story.
I'm so curious about how those who supported Brexit while also advocating for private education are reconciling this development. It's a bit of a head-scratcher.
It does present a bit of a cognitive dissonance, doesn't it?
Right.
This VAT policy is a direct result of Brexit, but perhaps not the result that many anticipated.
Talk about ironic. They got what they wanted with Brexit, but maybe not in the way they expected.
Right. It'll be interesting to see if this unexpected consequence shifts the public discourse around Brexit at all. Will it lead to a reevaluation of the costs and benefits of leaving the EU?
That's a great question. Perhaps it'll force people to look at the complexities of these issues more deeply, moving beyond this simplistic binary thinking.
Or it could further entrench existing divisions, with some doubling down on their support for Brexit, while others see this as proof of its negative consequences. Only time will tell.
This is a real turning point in UK education policy, and it's going to be fascinating to see how it all unfolds. But for now, we've covered a lot of ground. In the final part of our deep dive, we'll take a step back and consider some of the broader implications of this VAT on private school fees. Okay, we are back for the final part of our deep diving to this VAT on private school fees. It's been quite a journey, unpacking the layers of this complex issue.
It has. We've explored, the politics, the economics, and even the raw emotions fueling this debate around this new policy.
And what stands out to you as we sort of take a step back and look at the bigger picture?
I think that Reddit thread we've been discussing has been a real eye-opener.
Yeah.
It's a stark reminder that these policy decisions aren't happening in a vacuum. They're impacting real people, real families, and sparking, some very real anxieties about fairness and the future of education in the UK.
One thing that really struck me was just how personal experiences really shape people's perspectives on this issue.
Yeah.
We heard from people whose grandparents are upset about losing that winter fuel payment,
Right.
a benefit that's, intended to help with heating costs,
Right.
even while they criticize others for receiving government assistance.
Yeah, those stories highlight that generational divide in how people view economic fairness and the
Yeah.
role of government.
Yeah.
What might seem like a minor inconvenience to one person could be a significant financial burden to another. It underscores the importance of empathy and recognizing that these lived experiences, really shape our perceptions.
It's those human stories that often get lost, in the policy debates. It's easy to get caught up in the numbers and the abstract arguments, but it's essential to remember that there are real people behind those statistics, each with their own, unique story and perspective.
Absolutely. It's those individual narratives that bring these complex issues to life and remind us why they matter so much.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways for our listener?
Okay.
What should they be thinking about as this new policy takes effect?
Well, first and foremost, recognize that this VAT is a significant shift in UK education policy. It's a bold move by the government, and the long-term consequences are still very uncertain. I think it's important to stay informed and engaged as this story continues to unfold.
And as we've discussed, there are valid concerns on both sides of the debate.
Yeah.
Will it lead to greater investment in state schools, as the government claims? Or will it exacerbate social segregation and place undue burdens on those middle-class families?
It's crucial to have those critical discussions. Weigh the potential benefits and risks and hold our elected officials accountable for their decisions.
Hmm.
The future of education in the UK is at stake, and, we all have a role to play in shaping that future.
Well said. And here's a final thought to leave our listener with.
Okay.
If this VAT does lead to more students moving from private to state schools, how will that impact the state education system? Will it be a positive catalyst for change, leading to more funding and resources for all students, or will it create new challenges and strains on an already stretched system?
That's the million-pound question.
Mm.
I think the success of this policy will ultimately depend not just on generating revenue, but on how those funds are used to improve the quality of education for all students, regardless of their background. It's something we all need to watch very closely and engage with in a meaningful way.
We've covered a lot of ground today, but this conversation is far from over. This is just the beginning of a new chapter in UK education. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep engaging in those critical conversations about the kind of society we want to create. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.